Awesome. All right. So fundamentally, what I'm sort of approaching with this talk really is it's not so much of a talk. It's more of I would imagine you could call it a one-way conversation, but I'd imagine this is something that someone could sort of bring up anytime. It's something that it's definitely a sort of conversation topic in the past for me. It's and the it arises from really the question is what is sustainable development. We throw around the term sustainable development a lot. It is fundamentally guiding public policy for a lot of countries, and it is something that has been more or less uh, understood to be a positive thing for every nation. You don't necessarily see much pushback against the concept of sustainable development, but you do see some against globalization in general, right? But sustainable development, for one, has been relatively popular. Um, and so, the question really is, what is sustainable development? A lot of people have a rough idea. It's the UN goals. They were set after the Millennium Development Goals. They came together in 2015. The idea is so that all the nations in the world can basically build up and sort of have a more advanced society while maintaining some sort of preservation of the environment, development in a manner that wasn't harmful, that didn't cause harm onto others, right? But that's a very it's a very, I would say, at least formal sort of understanding of what it is. It's a very textbook dictionary defined way of looking at sustainable development, right? And so I think one of the issues that we have when we discuss sustainable development is that nobody really knows what they mean, and to understand what something means, what does developing mean to each person, what is sustainability to each person, you have to look at it within the context of where they're from, their sort of prior understanding of the society, of the nation state. These are very different things. So if you look at, for example, within Asia itself, you have China, which has a very strong nation state, India, which has a very strong society, and you have Southeast Asia, which have historically been these maritime nations that have been primarily centered around trade. And if you look at countries like Singapore, to this day they still maintain that sort of the fact that they're sort of trade based as well, right? And so what they would view as sustainable development is different in certain areas. But there are two general themes. Those are two general themes to the SDGs. To all, you can divide the 16 SDGs, the 16 Sustainable Development Goals out of all of them. 17 Sustainable Development Goals. You can divide them, and you can basically put them in two buckets. You've got one bucket which is dealing with the issues that historic issues that are sort of you talk about ending world hunger, you talk about things such as you talk about peace, justice, strong institutions. These sustainable development goals, gender equality, reduced inequalities, all these sustainable development goals, they're dealing with issues that have been created in the past. So these are sort of pre-existing problems that we're dealing with right now. And then you have another set of sustainable development goals that are dealing with issues that are becoming more and more of an issue, like SDG 13, which is climate action. Um, and so when you look at them in these sort of two buckets of sustain these goals deal with issues of the past. These goals are dealing with sort of upcoming issues that are getting worse and worse as time goes on. You're able to sort of view it within your sort of regional lens, wherever you are, a lot better, and your personal lens. So I think we live in a world right now where it is much easier to be divided, right? So now let's say the issues that are coming up, like climate change. If you take a look at climate change specifically, and you're to say, well, okay, I want to solve this problem. The world we live in right now makes it very difficult for people to come together and come to solutions in that problem. And say, for example, you were to impose some sort of carbon tax, or say, for example, you're supposed to impose some kind of emissions limits. It is very difficult sometimes to put those limits in place, to put that carbon tax in place, because you have certain interest groups, certain people that manipulate, democracy in some cases. In very extreme cases, you have lobbyists sort of, manipulating democracy in a certain sense. It's in the more extreme cases. or in some cases you have sort of general populations opposing something. You can see a similar situation in some coal producing regions where coal miners would not be very happy with the idea that the nation is moving away from coal. And that's actually a very understandable sentiment. I think it's very understandable for someone to be concerned that their livelihood is being taken away because of, sort of the nation's agenda, sort of what it's doing. And they have every right to be upset about it. So within a specific context, the way the world is right now, we're so divided, and so the discussion, the way we talk about things is so polarized right now that when people oppose a certain initiative, even for legitimate reasons, to say, for in the example of the coal miners in that case, they still, there really isn't a means to sit down, have an honest discussion and get to a consensus. We're not very good at building consensus anymore. Fundamentally, the UN is a consensus-based organization. That's why it takes time for the UN to do things, which is one of the biggest criticisms of the UN is why isn't it doing something? And then there's the other criticism of, well, the UN is doing so many things. Why are you doing things, right? And so the reason why it takes time to do significant things is because it requires consensus. There are some exceptions. There's some areas where consensus could be defined by the permanent five members of the Security Council just saying, look, we're fine with this, and we want the rest of you to be fine with this, and that could work out. But generally speaking, anything of a large scale requires some form of consensus, and even with the world's five, largest powers, or the five winners of World War II, whatever you define it, the P5 within the UN, they don't necessarily agree on things a lot. You're talking about countries like the United States and China and Russia. They're not always agreeing with each other as well. So even when, even in the most concentrated view of power, it's not necessarily, a place where consensus happens frequently, right? So it's hard. Even within the UN, it's hard. Then we go down to the local level. We go down to the actual discussions about policy, and you have these coal miners here who are genuinely, legitimately upset that they may actually lose their livelihoods. And you also have, the fact that the system is very slow to get things done. You have an incredibly polarized discussion, so you can't even, sit down with them, find out what exactly, what exactly they can do, what exactly, the sort of requirements they have, maybe come up with some sort of government scheme where you could sort of provide them, some sort of income, like a basic income, a minimum income for a period of time while they upscale or change. I'm not so much on the boat of the whole upskilling thing, because I don't really believe it's as simple as maybe a year's course or 2 years course, and you're sort of you're an engineer or whatever. It depends. It's a person to person sort of thing. And you got to give people the ability to live while they look for another job. And so it's kind of like that, right? If you were to get down to the discussion with these coal miners, the chances are, look, they're just trying to protect their livelihoods. There's got to be a way for you to do that in some way, like ensure that they have money coming into their bank accounts, ensure that they're surviving, that their basic needs are met. Because fundamentally, we keep forgetting that here human beings are human beings. They need food. They need water, they need shelter, that kind of thing. We forget these things sometimes, and we don't because of how polarized the discussion is. We don't sit down and discuss these things. They're off protesting, and they're off sort of buying into certain media, which will paint a certain image, whereas there are other groups that buy into a different media which paint a different image, and then you have this whole nobody's talking to each other and no progress is made on that. And that's bad enough, right? So that's bad enough. It makes it a bit more difficult for certain countries, especially those sort of a pluralistic democracy like India as well, specifically. Would this communication is important. It's not like it's not a one party state. You can't just dictate what happens. Malaysia is also a good example of this. You can't. I mean, Malaysia is a bit more. The government has a little bit more power, I'd imagine. But you can't really dictate what you want. It becomes law. You can't. If for example, tomorrow Malaysia decides that we are not, we're going to scrap all palm oil production. It's unrealistic. We're not going to scrap all palm oil production tomorrow. But if Malaysia does decide that, if we say we're going to scrap all palm oil production, and we're going to start reforesting. We're going to, start planting, sort of the same forest trees that were there before, and increase the nation's forest cover. And if it would have happened immediately, you would have the same sort of issue, right? You'd have the smallholders, the people in the plantations. They would be pretty upset. They wouldn't be very happy about the idea that they're being told, look, the entire industry is shutting down. It's not good for the environment. And so it's then when you look at like how do you communicate with these people, and because we have that broken communication, this could happen anywhere. The point is basically it can happen anywhere in the world. It's just that nations with a slightly stronger a slightly stronger system are able to implement these things, but the backlash will still exist. People will still be upset, and it's going to cause discontent, right? The dialogue has been I like to say the dialogue has been damaged throughout the world for a long time. It's not like it's very hard for us to start sitting back and on the same table and discussing things, just because of the nature of mostly social media. I pin most of the blame on social media, but I also pin part of the blame on this over politicking of of sort of non-political issues. I would imagine you could say things like climate change. This shouldn't be a political issue. It really shouldn't be a political issue, and um, I don't want to throw shade at any politician, but any politician that does decide to make climate change a political issue and say that it's climate change denial, the scientific reality of existence, right? If that becomes a political issue, that is excessive politicking. That's bad. That's a bad thing. You want to ensure that you're dealing with the problems, not turning them into a topic of discussion, a hot topic, so to speak. Um, so that's what happens when that's what happens when we have this polarized world, and that's how we're treating issues that are coming up. Again, I mentioned the two buckets, right? First bucket is the issues of the past, and the second bucket the issues that are sort of up and coming, right? So this is how we're treating the ones that are up and coming. Maybe we have a bit of better luck with issues of the past, right? Like gender equality, or reduced inequalities itself, the right to education. That's fundamental. I'm sure it's very hard to find someone who disagrees that every child has the right to school education, right? But it becomes a little bit different if you were to change that slightly, and if you were to say, what about university education? And if I were to ask the same question, should every citizen or every president or every person in the country have a right to however you frame it, right? You can start with citizen because it's always easiest, right? If a citizen Does a citizen have a right to a university education for free? Should the public universities in that country provide free education to potential university students? That's a debatable topic, right? But that is technically also it's not the target that these are not the targets that the UN is looking for in the sustainable development goals. But it is something you can pick up on. You realize that again, it's all definition based, right? If you're fine with primary secondary education, generally there isn't much opposition to it. Some of them we can get through, right? But in a changing world, it is very much necessary for us to look at these things. This is the reason why the Millennium Development Goals were rehashed out into the Sustainable Development Goals, because the world changed, and the world is going to change again. It is changing right now. It's changing at a rate that it rivals the previous industrial revolution. That's why it's called an industrial revolution. I don't know how far I want to buy into the idea that it's the same as the steam engine, but I would say as much as society is changing, as much as the nature of work is changing, you can see some parallels, and it is something that we should address. And there's a very reasonable chance that education will require beyond just a high school diploma. It will require beyond just finishing high school. It will require you to have a degree, or at least some form of post school education, right? And so that's kind of why if you draw the line at high school, you're kind of missing out on that kind of thing. So even with the bucket of sustainable development goals that we're fairly certain we can do, and there's not much opposition to. Um, yeah, we're still not really able to, let's say the targets were to adapt to match what the world needs. We're not really able to make it there, right? And it gets worse. So that's one example. That is the education. If we had more ambitious goals for education, sure, it would be tough. As it stands, the goals we have, they're doable. I think that they're very much doable, so long as governments pay attention to it. Quality education. It's not just any form of education; it's quality education. We want people to study in a conducive environment, and that involves plenty of factors. It's not just the books you get class, although that's a chunk of it, right? If you're not getting textbooks, it's difficult for you to study. But it's also things like internet access. We had distance learning going on in Malaysia for quite a while, and you notice there it depends. So Malaysia is an interesting country where you have pockets of the country that are very rich, by comparison to the rest of the country, and you have other areas in the country that are not exactly there yet. When I say not exactly there yet, not all of them are in extreme poverty. There are groups in extreme poverty everywhere, but Malaysia still does have that issue. But there also are groups that are sort of in between, and they cannot. A family of five there cannot afford to have sort of 4 or 5 devices for everyone to do distance learning, right? If you're doing distance learning, you're sharing one device, and you're all in different classes, right? Now, obviously, that's sort of a result of the pandemic, right? That's a symptom of well, not of COVID, but of the pandemic itself. It's kind of not an actual medical symptom, but it's the system not being able to handle that kind of like the kind of pandemic that we had, right? But you can see the impact on a lot of these children who could not access education because of that. And you can see because of a government inability. Sometimes it's not just the focus; it's also the inability that they just are not capable of sort of dealing with that situation at that time. You can see the effect it has on children. You can see the effect it has on the grades coming in. The fact we had to lower the test scores required to get a certain grade and stuff like that. Some people say it's a lost generation, things like that. It's bad. It's pretty bad. Um, and so that it's kind of it's really where you draw the line with the bucket of sustainable development goals that deal with issues of the past, because with issues of the past it's going to be more common to find people that agree that gender inequality is a problem, that world hunger is a problem, that lack of access to clean water is a problem, that kind of thing. These you're going to find a lot more people agreeing with you and saying, well, yes, this is definitely an issue, versus even climate change to some extent, because a lot of people tend to sort of brush off things like climate change, in industrial automation and things like that. There are still significant enough groups of people that do not think it's a serious enough problem, despite the fact that there's a very real likelihood you have heat waves going on all over the place. Uh, Give it some time, and this is a slow progression. What we're watching right now is a slow progression of the unraveling of the world. That's kind of what climate change is right now. And you give it a couple of years, and you're going to see heat waves that could, but you might. I'm going to be scientific about this and say you might see heat waves that could potentially shut down electricity grids. And it's like we saw the breakdown of systems during the pandemic. The breakdown of systems that we will see over time due to this will be pretty bad. Although because it's over a longer period of time, it gives us a chance to adapt. That's kind of why we're asking everyone to start adapting. But when there's certain sort of weather patterns or heat waves, things like floods and stuff like that, when the first few start hitting, we're not really going to be prepared to deal with that, and that's going to cause a lot of loss of life. You're going to have people dying from extreme heat because they could not get electricity to turn on their fans or air conditioning if it is too intense. Uh, you're going to have people sort of their houses flooded away. You're going to have emergency response not able to deal with the sheer volume of these floods and these kind of weather patterns that you'll be seeing, right? Hurricanes, etc., etc. It's going to be so challenging that if the government is not prepared to deal with it, there's going to be a lot of loss of life, far more than COVID. In a much shorter period of time, once things start getting really bad. Um, but people are willing to dismiss that. People are willing to sort of criticize. I think the IPCC needs to come up with a report that says that uses a couple more expletives, because that the message is not getting out. How bad it's getting. And that bucket of sort of upcoming challenges, climate action, industrial automation, stuff like that. Those SDGs, protecting life on water, life on land, all those SDGs. People don't really see the need, the need to go along with those SDGs, whereas they do see the need to go along with the SDGs that are more historic, right? Society sort of has ingrained some sort of challenges. You have, gender inequality is the most obvious one, and there's the lack of education to certain groups of people. These things are societal issues in every country. These things, we know that they're issues. There's also a problem there, right? I mean, it sounds a bit doom and gloom. This ends on a positive note, trust me. Sounds a bit doom and gloom, but the climate change stuff, that's bad. We got to do something about that. We really need to do something about that. That's very serious. We're not taking that half as seriously as we should, and it's embarrassing, frankly, to look at sort of the way we're sort of ignoring what's going to happen there. But if you look at the other bucket, which is stuff that we're aware, we're willing, and most people agree are very serious, important issues, and that they're willing to dedicate resources to deal with in a lot of times, right? They're willing to dedicate resources to it. They're never really solving the root cause sometimes, are they? And I think the best example is we take the SDG of reduced inequalities, right? The reduced inequalities is a very interesting one, because one of the things that pain people of my generation. I'll go along with that if I haven't already expunged upon the fact that we might die from climate change. But I think one of the things that annoys my generation was the generational wealth gap, where I think a lot of people, maybe in the audience or maybe back home listening, you had a decent shot at life, didn't you? You were able to earn a good salary for that time. It was a very good salary. You were able to purchase a house much cheaper. Even taking into account inflation, you're able to purchase a house much cheaper. Taking inflation into account, you had a better salary. You basically were able to sort of build a life in a way that a lot of young people can't. And now you hold on to the wealth of that life that you have built, whereas young people can try to make that wealth, but they're not going to be able to, for example, purchase a house because the market is in such a manner. Right? The generational wealth gap is one example of an inequality in society, and to sort of deal with that inequality, um, you need to have ways to support young people. I mean, no, you don't necessarily need to go in and take other people's property. I think that's a misconception. You don't have to go and sort of take someone's house or anything like that. But if you marginally increase the tax rates likely on certain corporations, or if you were to introduce a carbon tax, which also kind of solves helps, not doesn't solve, but helps deal with the climate change issue, channel some of that money into some of the societal issues and things like that. It's nobody wants to do that, right? Nobody wants to sort of deal with that because it's not necessarily popular, is it? This whole generational wealth gap thing. A matter of fact is that in most democracies, young people have not historically been involved in the electoral process. They have been more spectators to the sport, so to speak. They're not always the people sort of going out there and agitating for, well, they agitate for change, but they won't do it electorally. That's kind of the trend that we see around the world historically. It is changing now. So there's some hope there. But that's one example of these kind of inequalities, and the inertia, the political inertia to do something about it is purely because it's not a priority, because it's not popular. And that's again, that's just something we know that's wrong. The fact that some people are just sort of priced out of the entire market, priced out of the ability to live in a house that they own, to buy their own house. They're completely priced out of it. If you look at the average sort of income, right? But we're not doing anything about it just because it does. There's no political will to do something about it. It's actually one of the easier issues. Um, I'll give you another example. If you take a look at the financial crisis in 2008, at the end of the day, the banks that gambled on people's savings, well, yeah, in a sense, people's savings, they gambled on that, and the banks got bailed out. But the people that lost their homes, they didn't get bailed out. In the United States, at least, that didn't exactly work out. Now, a lot of lessons have been taken from that. I certainly think like the way that that has led to sort of the understanding that there is, well, one is there is no bank too big to fail, is the saying, but also that the richest people in society, the people who hold the most wealth, they live a fundamentally different life than everyone else. You can see this. You can see this in COVID, right? They can escape. They can escape the repercussions of gambling with billions and trillions of dollars. Right? They can just throw money there, other people's money. They can throw it in the air, and they walk away scot free. Just not nearly enough people went to jail after the 2008 crisis, and I think people saw that. People outside did see that. So it's not an unnoticed thing. But we did see during the pandemic where richer people were able to get away with breaking the law, breaking the rules and the law, and sort of avoid quarantines. They were able to travel abroad when the borders were closed for non-legitimate reasons. Right? They were able to go for functions and sort of events. They organize themselves, private parties, that kind of thing. They got away with this kind of thing because they're rich. And you see some cases. In the more extreme case, I think a single mother in Malaysia was spent a night in lockup for leaving her house, while there was a politician that went to New Zealand for approximately for a few months. I can't exactly remember how many months, but he was a minister, a cabinet minister. He left and he went to New Zealand on a holiday, while the rest of us were sort of slogging it out through the rest of the pandemic, right? Um, Former minister, not so, well, I mean, he's a minister again now, I guess, but he did this in his capacity as former minister. And this happens, right? It's not a uniquely Malaysian problem. It's not a uniquely Asian problem, and it's something obviously that they the bankers could do in the U.S. It is very much a global problem, right? These inequalities exist, but it is something. Now, if we were to say, right, that we want to put in sort of regulations. So if you say you want to have prosecution that isn't selective. You want to clean up your police force, your judiciary. You want to sort of introduce financial regulations, these kind of things. This leans in a little bit into SDG 16, which is about sort of institution building as well to some extent, but mostly peace. If you want to deal with that, it may be popular. This is the strange thing, right? Now with SDGs that deal sort of with the future, that kind of thing, climate change and all that, you have this polarized discussion, and people are sort of they're not fully aware of how incredibly messed up it's going to be. They're not aware of how horrible it's going to be in the future. So that is due to some extent due to a lack of awareness, and politicians sort of sitting on their behinds as opposed to doing their jobs, and dealing with future challenges as well, right? So those are the SDGs in the bucket of what's upcoming. The SDGs in the bucket of sort of what we know are already problems still aren't dealt with. And it's because of that inertia. It's because, the politicians just don't see a need to do it. And they're actually popular. These are popular things. If you were to ask a majority of people whether they would like public university to be free, public university education in this country in any country to be free, a majority of people generally in most countries actually agree with that kind of position, right? Now, how you do it, makes a difference. Obviously, where the money comes from and stuff like that, or if you're going to be you're going to have like a very good sort of system that sources, teachers, lecturers from the students that study, that kind of thing. You have a good system, or whatever. That's important, right? But the fundamental idea, these fundamental things, like there should be a female president of the United States. I'd imagine most Americans are very much fine with that idea. That doesn't do as much to solve gender inequality as people think. But these are examples of statements that will sort of have a very significant bearing on whether or not something is done in a country, if the people up there were listening, which they're not. And when I say the people up there, I don't mean the Almighty. I think the Almighty is much better at listening politicians clearly. But the politicians up there are the ones that are completely disconnected. And so when you have, even if you have a good solution to something, they're either too corrupt, which is in the case of lobbyists and political donations into their campaigns, or they are just not bothered about it. It doesn't affect them enough. It's not popular enough for them to sort of justify. It's not like it's not popular enough with their base, right? So this is popular with the majority of people. These are things that a majority of people would agree on, but it's not what gets their base politically excited. And so at the end of the day, even with things that we know are problems, we can't solve it because the dialogue, the politics of the day has become so sour, has become so toxic. Um, so yes, yeah, with the sustainable development goals, all 17 of them, the ones that are meant to deal with up and coming issues like climate change, automation, that kind of thing, those SDGs, life on land, life in water, that kind of preserving the earth, that kind of stuff, those SDGs are not being acted upon because the politics of the day sort of sees it as not important. The SDGs that deal with historical issues, that deal with historical inequalities, the right to food, water, that kind of thing, right, quality education, reducing inequalities, they're not being dealt with because the politicians just couldn't really be that bothered about it. It is fundamentally not what is again benefiting them politically in the next electoral cycle. It's all about survivability, and that's not helping them directly in the next election. It's very rare that you find the government sort of truly address these issues, aside from sort of doing some half-baked measure. So if you were to say yes, if someone like constituents are not the richest and they may need assistance to get through the pandemic, or we need to sort of have some sort of program to sort of take care, decarbonize, plant trees, that kind of thing. I'm sure that's there, but these are not nearly half as they're not even 1% really what needs to be done to deal with the scale of the problem, right? And there are some exceptions. I won't deny that there are some exceptions here. I'm not here to say that every politician is evil. Of course not. Fundamentally, politicians they yes they play politics. That's kind of why we're in this mess. Mostly social media. I sort of mostly blame social media for exacerbating that. But the politics of it is the politics of it, right? There always will be politicians that sort of are trying to do something, trying to get something done within sort of a very broken system. So I'm not saying don't I'm not saying hate all the politicians. That's not necessarily what I'm saying. What I'm saying is hold them accountable, right? And this is sort of where the things become a bit more positive, right? Yes, world governments are not very good at getting things done. Climate change will, in all likelihood, the way things are going, kill a lot of people. It'll make your children's lives miserable. If you're above the age of 40, you can start worrying about your children's lives, maybe your own life in a sense. If you're above the age of like 50, then yeah, it's more of your kids' problem as opposed to your problem, which I can understand. But you will also, you're going to live your old age in a pretty bad time. It's not going to be great if everything's messed up during your golden years, so to speak, either, right? Um, so it's bad. Climate change is going to get really bad. We have so much political inertia, we can't do anything about it. The dialogue and discourse is so I'm fighting. No, I read my news here, you read your news from here. There's this agenda behind this, there's that agenda behind that. Um, that makes it hard for people to progress. And the likelihood is if we don't do something, if things don't change, it's going to be like the next 20 years are going to be really bad. That's probably the mildest way to put it. And I think that's not something I'm not gonna pre-qualify that by saying might or could be very bad. If we don't do anything, it's gonna be terrible. And you're seriously gonna regret. Like you're gonna ask yourself, well, what did I do then when I had the chance to do something? Because this is bad. It's like I'll put it this way: climate change is sort of one of those issues where it's like if you were in Wuhan and you could have stopped the start of the pandemic somehow. If you had ways to sort of encourage, if people were talking about trying to prevent another pandemic before COVID-19, And they had actually done some sort of, they had set up a very good sort of method of sort of containing local transmission. We may not have had a global pandemic as bad as it was here. It would have probably still gone abroad, yes, but we would have been a hell of a lot more prepared. And that's the same thing with climate change. Like the thing is about climate change is we know it's coming. Um, and it's not, a lot of people like to make predictions about like 2100. All the oceans are gonna, they're all gonna melt. So the ice caps are gonna melt, the oceans are gonna rise. It's gonna be like, one summer or like one year, everything gets, melted out, and all the cities start sinking just over the course of one year. It doesn't happen like that. If you look at the scientific modeling, it's not an immediate thing. It takes time. So when we say by 2100, what we're really saying is, it gets 1% worse every year, and it's going to reach a point that's unbearable a lot sooner than people think, because it's not an on-off switch. It's a progressively worse situation. Um, so yeah, that's bad. And obviously, I've gone through how bad inequality can be, but just to give like an additional primer on that one, uh, if this level of income inequality, which is pretty damn high. I mean, if you to look at some global income inequality, it's really bad right now. The pandemic has exacerbated it. We've had sort of crises and recessions and stuff like that that has seen a wealth transfer from the general population to the richest population. You'd see, instances like the pandemic, where small businesses even are put out of business. People are left unemployed, and you're left with an economy that is, sort of saturated wealth in sort of the top, as some people would say, like the top 1% of society, right? Like the wealth is completely saturated in their pockets. This can lead to some very serious societal issues. We've seen a lot of sort of protests around the world, that kind of thing. And I'm not talking specifically about the anti-vaccine passport protest, whatever that is. That is slightly different, but you could argue to some extent that the dissatisfaction they have with the way their country is being run may stem from something similar, although they have a very specific concern about authority. That's it's more of an anti-authority thing, than an economic thing. But you do see a number of protests around the world sort of popping up, and that has been going on for quite a long time, for the past few years actually. You see a lot of these protests popping up, and a lot of the people that attend these protests, uh, they are agitating for change because, to them, right, whether it's a political change, whether it's a structural change, they feel like that would make the system better, so that they could live a better life. And the core understanding among a lot of these protesters, um, there's some exceptions again. There are some exceptions, but generally the trend seems to be that, look, you're not the government's not listening to the people, and more importantly, we're not living a decent enough life. We're not living a good enough life. We could have a better life. Whether the issues range. It could be police brutality. It could be, in some cases, legitimate expressions of a overreaching government authority. Like in the case of a dictatorship, so to speak, you'd have a bit more trouble protesting. But a country that's sort of sliding towards that, or countries being more authoritarian in how it works, a democracy that's being more authoritarian, you could find a very legitimate sort of protest there, towards, against authoritarianism towards democracy, right? People are unhappy. You see that more and more frequently. And although they have very different reasons, the core of it is always because they're not living a good enough life as it is. That's going to get worse if we let income inequality continue to rise like this. You're going to see an increase in crime. You're going to see an increase in violent crime, a lot more protests, significant increase in protests, um, which could be a good thing, but in this case, the violent aspect of it could get a bit dicey. You're going to see, sort of all sorts of conflicts. You're going to see this polarization, the politicking of everything could even get worse. the fact that we're not dealing with historical challenges as well, um, not nearly efficiently enough. We're not dealing with these systemic inequalities. That we're not dealing with it well enough is going to cause, could potentially, maybe going to is a bit much, but I'll go as far as say could potentially cause the breakdown of society, and even in some of the strongest societies in the world. So India, again, the one of the oldest, strongest societies in the world. Even in a country like India, it's totally possible that if we were to keep this level of inequality in society, where some people are earning so little and some people are earning so much, where some people are capable of doing whatever they want, breaking any laws they want, so long as they can pay the bribe as a fine, and some other people are really not able to live just live a decent life. That could be a problem. Same thing applies to every other country. India is actually one of the countries that has a better chance of holding out to like societal breakdown, because just purely because of the size and the scale of its society. It's a very old, very strong society that it has, which could potentially resist some form of societal breakdown because of sort of the family unit, and there's certain aspects to Indian culture that make it unique and sort of capable of withholding. But if enough people are agitated enough and enough people are suffering enough, there is no power on earth. Maybe there is a power beyond the earth, but not on earth. To deal with that kind of backlash. Um, so it's bad. But SDGs, they're trying to solve problems. Problems can be historic, problems can be up and coming, and clearly, I've expanded on great detail as to why we are failing miserably at dealing with both. Right? It's just the dialogue, the division in society. I promise I'll end on a positive note. I think I may have sort of been a bit negative, I guess, in so far. And there's a reason for that because that's kind of the state that we are in right now, right? The positive note, though, is that um, there is, we can solve these problems. This is what we tend to forget sometimes when there's a large enough community of young people that are convinced society and the world is going to collapse. A large enough. It's a scarily large group of young people that have just completely given up on sort of society, the world, and government and politics and everything, and just given up on sort of the future in general, which is that's bad. That's you don't want that to happen. And sort of, I think the issue really is because you're not really able to have a united response to anything. You're not we lack that unity. Again, everything is divided up. Polarized political discussions going on all the time. You never really have an honest. A lot of times, right? If there's someone that you disagree with vehemently on a certain political issue nowadays, you wouldn't think of sitting down and having a discussion with them. If there's one thing that they disagree with you on, if it's a big enough thing for you, you wouldn't really listen to what they have to say about anything else, right? And now, granted, there are certain things which you would say are unforgivable, right? If someone is, for example, a racist, like if you're a racist, um, you're not a good person. There may be reasons why you are a racist. You may not realize you are a racist, right? You may believe in certain things because you think it's not harming other people by believing in those things. But if you're going to stand by those things, then you're going to stand by harming other people due to your belief that you are superior to them. That my religion or my ethnic group or my people are superior to these other people. You're not a good person. It's fair enough to say that it's not going to be very productive having a conversation with a person that believes that you are inferior to them or your culture is inferior to them. Um, it's not going to be a productive discussion. You're not actually going to solve any problems, right? But there are, if you talk about the general population, you're not looking at like everyone being racist. The general population, what you would see is disagreements over much smaller things, much smaller issues. It's like the party you vote for in an election. It's things like do you believe in reforming this aspect of the government or changing this or changing that. These are things that are enough sometimes for people not to even have a conversation over. the polarization of media, and thanks to social media as well to some extent, has even increased the divisions between ethnic groups and religions to some extent. So much so that we find ourselves saying things like, we don't really find ourselves saying that, but we find people around us saying things like on the internet and stuff, saying things like, we're gonna buy, for example, from our religious groups. For example, I want to buy products from my religious group first, my own sort of religious group first, to support my own religious group. That kind of thing. You see that happening, and people don't, in this, it's that becomes a very common thing. Like it's this idea of I help my people, I do my thing for my people, and we sort of branch off, right? Instead of saying, so instead of saying something like, I'm going to support small business, right, during the pandemic. The first thing that we see nowadays, at least in Malaysia, one of the things we saw was a group trying to say buy products from this religious group first, as opposed to sort of buy from small businesses. Now there was enough of a backlash in Malaysia at that time to that campaign for it to not go as far as it could have, and I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful to the campaign was buy Muslim first, and I'm grateful specifically to a lot of Malaysian Muslims who stood up and said, well, this is nonsense. There are a lot of people suffering in the pandemic. If we're going to be buying from someone first, let's buy from small businesses first. It's stuff like that, right? And although the Buy Muslim First campaign didn't start during the pandemic, it started before that, and the backlash was going on and on and on. You notice sort of the shift to like buy from small businesses during the pandemic, and you notice sort of how that evolved, right? And obviously there are groups of people that sort of stuck to it, and they still do, and they still think that it's a good idea. I mean, maybe there's an argument to be made that helping your own community is good, and that's fine, right? But it's the discussion, is the language of which that comes from that. It's a very protectionist sort of my own community thing, without really understanding the larger problem. That is fundamentally the problem. This is just one example of what, one minor example. Right? This adopts the language in some regard of like what the problem really is, the core of the problem is, and that is that we can't really come together and deal with a certain issue, right? If I were to say the takeaway of today is go home, find every single person, every single human being you can talk to, and start thinking about climate change and figuring out what you can do. Because you don't want to leave the world in a horrible state, right? You try to do that, but at the end of the day, there's so many existing divisions in society that it becomes people can't center around one specific thing, and there is sort of again, like I said, the whole collapse thing, where a group of young people that think, well, that's it, we're done for, it's game over. Now, the positive note that I've been delaying, I've been putting this off a little bit, because sometimes I feel like I need to emphasize how bad things are getting before people truly understand how important this one positive thing is. It is no exaggeration to say that the world that we're living in today, the way things are going, is terrible. Absolutely terrible. There's some progress being made. The Sustainable Development Goals were created for the purpose of us moving forward, dealing with historical challenges and dealing with up and coming challenges. Those are the two buckets, right? That's the idea. But you have to understand how bad things are. The good news is this: there are groups of people who are willing to set aside, who are willing to sort of set aside, religion, ethnic groups, income, there's sort of career, so that kind of thing. I put it this way, right? We talk a lot about religion and ethnic groups and all that. We don't talk as much about sort of your income. If I would say this, that if you're a person, the same contempt I have for someone who is a racist, I would have the same contempt for someone who looks down upon someone who has a job in customer service, or has a job as who has a job as a trash collector or a mechanic, or that kind of thing. If you look down on a person because of their job or because of how much money they have, to some extent, I think you're worse than a racist. do that statement as you wish, but that is, these are sort of these are other divisions that we don't see, but we sort of, these divisions make it hard for us to do something about things like climate change, about the world, right? But again, the positive note is that there are groups of people that are truly and genuinely willing to see past it. You have these you have these climate activists that are sort of, they cut across everywhere, right? A lot of people, I think there's like a big media sensation on, on, they're trying, again, the whole politicizing and polarizing of the discussion is turning it into some sort of, oh, look, it's like a TV show kind of thing. It's not. If you look at the grassroots level, right? What's interesting is you get people from everywhere, whatever walk of life, whatever background, race, religion, caste, culture, creed, everything, income group, education, everything, right? You find people from everywhere. In fact, you're now starting to see age as well. Although they happen to be mostly young people because, we're going to live most of our lives through this. Thank you. But, you're starting to see older people also realize, and I'm sure a lot of the people here are fully aware of sort of, well, maybe not about how bad it could get. I think, even I had to do quite a bit of research to, like, and I do quite a bit of reading to really understand what could happen. But I'm sure everyone's aware that it's a problem and it's bad, and we need to do something about it. And so you see, even older people are joining in that sort of climate activism and sort of agitating for movement on that particular issue. Um, and these people are not divided by their political beliefs. I mean, if you could say climate change is a political issue, but I just say survival really. If survival is a political issue, then everything's a political issue. So there are groups of people that are just getting just completely dismissing these so preconceived notions, dispositions that they have against each other, and they're addressing these problems as the problems that they truly are, that they really are, right? Income inequality, where we're not moving as fast on that one as we should. Education, gender equality, I would like if we'd move a bit faster, but we are moving. I would like it would move a bit faster. I don't think we're moving fast enough. It's not specifically in Asia. I really don't think we're moving fast enough. We could do more, is what I'm saying, in some of these areas. Quality education. Look, I'm the kind of person that would say give everyone at the age of 15 a laptop. The government can afford it, or certain countries the government can afford it, and if they can't, raise taxes for it. Because look, I'm not gonna be mad if my income tax increases by even what 15%. If the country is not in crisis, I'd like a stable country. I can pay I pay more income tax, but I'm down for that. And if I'm willing to pay the income tax, I'm willing to pay an increase on my tax. I'm saying, I wonder sort of what the motivation against doing that is. Of course, I believe families should have tax credits and stuff like that to allow them to do it. If you have a large family, obviously that tax burden is going to be bad, but this is the thing, right? If you target it, you can do something about it, is the point I'm making. And we're not doing something about this as much, but the good, promising thing, the most positive thing I have seen over the past few years is that there are people that are willing to push aside whatever religion, whatever race, whatever country you're from, whatever income you have, whatever education you have, everything, your age, even, absolutely everything, right? You could see a 96-year-old man and a 17-year-old from different religious backgrounds who live completely different lives, uh, agree on something like climate change. That the 96-year-old man, not to be grim about it, may not have that much time left in the world, but that man has a conscience and is willing to sort of you know stand up for what's right. And you have 16-year-old kid who's obviously got their whole lives ahead of them, and they're not holding the prejudice against the old man because they know it's not really his fault either, right? Yes, the previous generation was the steward of the planet for so long. Previous generations were the stewards of the planet in some regard. But we're not going to hold people, unless you're going to oppose this kind of thing, oppose positive change. You're not the enemy. Then that's the key is that people have realized, have come to the realization uh, that the average person, their neighbor, their friends, their family, their colleagues, the people they associate with, people on the internet even, their countrymen, the citizens of Asia, they are all also not their enemy. The next time you talk about if when you talk about a different group of people, or talk about a person you may disagree with, a person you may disagree with, uh, try to remember that they're not the enemy, and the enemy is a much larger threat, which could lead to, uh, you know, either the collapse of civilization in a dramatic manner that we have never seen or couldn't even imagine. In the most extreme case, I personally don't think it's going to be sort of a one-off, collapse like that. I think we will eventually force ourselves to adapt, but the crumbling of society is the enemy, not your neighbor, not your friend, not someone you disagree with on a particular issue. And sort of my entire point for this, this whole discussion of what is the sustainable development goals, um, is is basically the one way out of the crumbling of society, the crumbling of humanity, of civilization, the slow deterioration of everything we spent the past 2,000 years building, or even longer in some regards. They're just watching all of that burn. Is what happens if we don't take this seriously. And whether it is because of climate change, or whether it is because of such an unequal society, that people are willing to agitate and start, civil conflict and potentially even civil wars, rebellions and that kind of thing. Whichever bucket it winds up being, whether it is the SDGs that deal with the problems of the past or the up and coming problems. Um, the fundamental thing is people have started to realize that the 99%, the general population, the vast majority of people living in the world are not our enemies. We are not the enemies of each other. Whatever your race, religion, whatever your caste, whatever your background, everything, I can list out a million identifiers. The point is, by default, we're not each other's enemy. And people are realizing that. And so for me, it is important to bring that up when trying to explain the doom and gloom situation of the sustainable development goals, um, and sort of to put it into context. Is that events like this, things like this, they really change the way we look at the world. They change how we're going to deal with these problems. And it is when we unite together to solve a particular problem, when we look aside from all these divisions in society, that is when we solve it. Thank you very much.